Awesome. Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, April 25th, 2023. It's the week after KubeCon EU, so folks are still recovering from that, I'm sure. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. As all other CNCF meetings, we are sponsored by them, so please be nice and kind to everyone, and let's try to follow their rules. But yeah, otherwise that's about it. We'll go ahead and get rumbling today. Just before we dive into some stuff from the agenda, I don't want to put you on the spot, Surya, but or Shane, y'all went to KubeCon last week. Were there any good conversations around the admin network policy API or anything else we're working on that may be applicable to the group?
Yeah, I think it was definitely an enriching experience, right? So we had our SIG updates talk for the policy API parts of SIG network as well, which was unfortunately on a Friday evening as usual. So a lot of people had left, but I think the value that I found from the conference in relation to at least the A and P bits is just talking to the other CNI plugins like Cilium, Calico, and trying to get them to use this or convert their bits to us and see if they're having issues. So it's kind of trying to track down them on their boot and tracking issues on their side.
Awesome. Good to hear. Yeah, I'm sure like a lot of the value is just in the conversations you have. So glad it got a shout out. And let's just keep the momentum rolling out of it. I know we'll probably try to submit a admin network policy talk for Chicago. Do you know when that CFP deadline is? Or is it even open yet?
Not yet. It hasn't opened yet.
Sweet. And our goal is to get that in not on the last day this time.
Yeah, I was also talking to Shane about the conformance profiles, right? If we can start and get that done for our group as well, it's something that on a common ground that we could showcase as well. Let's see how it goes.
That reminds me, the prototype that I wrote with Mattia is now in a PR, so I'll send you that real quick.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll add that to the agenda. Yeah, I mean, if we can adopt like that from the get-go, instead of trying to blaze our own path with Cyclonus or something. I know it solves slightly different issues, but still, that would be awesome. I'll take a note of that.
Yeah, I think I was still inclined on using Cyclonus, similar to how Andrea is doing it for network policy, but I wanted the other part of it, the integration, to be a bit more seamless. Like once you run Cyclonus and you get the tests, then we use Shane's framework on publishing.
Correct.
Just so you know, I mean, Andrew, I think we're still seeing IDE rather than the agenda right now. I hope I'm not seeing any Red Hat preparatory.
Red Hat's open. We can look at it the rest of the day if you want. That's my bad. Thanks for letting me know.
No worries.
Cool. Too many windows going on. Okay, so Shane, did you send that PR in Slack or was it in
I just sent it here in Zoom.
Oh, right here.
And I think Contour and possibly Envoy Gateway might help us test it out as well, but we got it working at Kong with like, it's producing a conformance report, which ultimately in time we're gonna have sent back to Gateway API. So most of like the really fundamental machinery is there. So might be interesting since you guys are talking about maybe doing something similar here. And then Surya and I talked at some length at KubeCon about possibly needing to get this out of Gateway API, kind of abstracted the test suite, basically pulled out and abstracted a little bit and then put into Kubernetes SIG somewhere more general, especially if network policy starts to use it. So just keep in touch with me on what you're thinking and like what your, I guess the more important thing is what your bandwidth is for doing such a thing. And we will, I'll be on top of like making sure we do that, because I would hate for us to all end up with separate things that do effectively the same thing. So
no, 100%. I think as these implementations are getting done, I know Surya has made good progress and I know Yang is cracking away at it or pretty much almost there. This will become more important. So I think once those are kind of at a stable point, then we can kind of recenter together here in upstream and say, like, how can we test these in a uniform way? That's kind of where we're at, I think. Amazing.
Roger that.
Anything else on testing we want to talk about? Cool. Okay, so let's toss it over to Nadia to talk about a security zone use case. So is this another new use case you're going to propose, Nadia, or you're thinking about, or you came up with recently?
Yeah, that is. Can you hear me all?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the topics around the current API implementation, right? And that specific one is around tenants and same and not same labels. And you said that, well, for now, the API only applies on the namespace level for same and not same labels, right? Because we said that we expect tenants to be based on the namespaces, and it doesn't allow you to do that on the pod selector level. And I, let's say, found a use case where customer is actually using this kind of tenancy, which is in its essence is a security zone. So only pods in the same security zone are allowed to communicate with each other, and that forms something similar to a tenant, but it is based on pod labels instead of namespace labels.
Okay, so like
yeah.
you're basically saying in the API previously, we only defined a tenant as a namespace or a set of namespace. We didn't define it as a set of pods that may span namespaces. And you're saying that you found kind of a use case in the wild for that.
Yes.
Cool.
And yeah, and so what
I actually had a question on the use case, right? So why are they not segregating those pods as namespaces, which is what 99% of the users do, right? Like, why do they want to do this across namespace thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. If how many users actually do that, and there are some notes around that. So I know a lot of examples when a cluster admin creates all the namespaces, right? So there are not multiple owners of different namespaces that create their own pods. So what they are doing is, let's say you have 5 security zones, but you have thousands of pods in different namespaces. And in that specific case, especially where cluster admin owns all the namespaces, they may use namespaces a bit differently. And I've seen them being mostly split not on the ownership basis or something related to networking, as we are suggesting, right? But based on some logic, like a backend service or some application that is running, and they may have a lot of namespaces that logically means something to the workload. And it may be difficult for them, especially for customers that have large applications or sets of applications running in the same cluster, to actually restructure all the namespaces they have now to just fit that requirement. And I guess that's also the case in this example I'm sharing now.
But also, in case, let's say we go ahead with this, we agree that there is a valid use case here, right? Like in that case, even if same and not same is applicable on a namespace level, you still have that pod selector after it that you can use to then select a subset within, right, on the API.
Oh, that's a good question, because we haven't decided on how to use this same and not same labels finally, I guess, or like at least we have this discussion going, so it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic questions, right? I wish Dan Winship was here, because Dan and I talked a bit about this at KubeCon.
Oh,
and I think it's a bit early for me to even say this, right? Because we wanted to do Dan wanted to do a proper presentation. I don't want to speak for Dan, but to just bring some ideas that we spoke about. And I think Yang already has a PR to implement same labels on Antria, so I don't know if it's too late to bring this up, but we wanted to restructure and redefine tenancy a bit. So we wanted to replace same labels and not same labels with a field called tenancy right at the top of the spec in the API, right? Like along with the subject and peer that we define. And then the labels that we use to define tenancy, right? So that will be the subset that you define your peers for. So you cannot do this cross relationships with multiple labels and stuff. So whether it's the same or not same, right? That relation will be very much tied to the tenancy that we're defining, which will be a set of labels. But I know it's a bit confusing because it's still in the early stages. Like it was literally a random thought that we were writing on a pen and paper. So maybe Dan can share more thoughts in the upcoming meeting, but this is good discussion once again. And it's not fixed in stone. It's just an idea that we spoke about, right? And one thing that I think we can kind of agree on, I don't know, Yang, if you have thoughts here, is that there is still some discussions ongoing around these two things, right? Same and not same, not being really clear at this point. So my question is, should we rethink this in the V1 Alpha 1 part of the API, or can we maybe do it as a Alpha 2? So remove it now, but then re-add it in once we have like a better way of the definition here. Right.
Go ahead, sir. I need to think through it a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm kind of processing. I tend to agree that most of the API challenges that like Nadia has brought up recently, and a lot of what we've been discussing over the past couple of weeks have been with how we define and select tenants. So if we could think up an easier way to do that, I'm totally all ears. I think from a generic standpoint, like procedurally, we need to release something soon regardless. Like right now, we still haven't like packaged or released and done it. Obviously we have V1 Alpha 1 up in our repo, but we've been making like small fixes to it. If we're gonna start thinking about doing bigger things, like I'd really like to go ahead and say like, we're done small fixing. Let's do a small release, like a V1 Alpha 1 proper release and packaged unit. And then we can move on to either a V1 Alpha 2 or V1 Beta 1. That's kind of where I'm at, but I think this is totally something we should think about because it's leading to many problems.
I had the same thought, right? I don't want the same and not same discussion to stall the release or getting an implementation up, right? Because 90% of customers are actually happy with selectors. At least that's my understanding, right?
Yeah.
There is that 10% we still want to do that use case for tenancy on, but I think that's why I was saying if we can put this discussion for the next version of the API, but still do a release with the stable parts of the API that we know are like good. That's something.
Yeah. I mean, you and Yang have already been working on the implementation, so I don't want to keep like switching it up. Like I'd rather go ahead and hard cut our V1 Alpha 1 and then keep, if we think we're ready to, after y'all have started implementing it and everything seems to be right so far. And then at least on the API side of things, and then just keep iterating upstream.
But do you mean you want to cut with same and not same the way it is?
If at least the mechanism the way it is, right? Still using it. And if y'all have already designed to it, right? If you've already implemented Nova and Kubernetes and Yang's already implemented it in Antria.
I haven't, but I know Yang has. I saw his PR, so I'll let him speak.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify some of the things, right? So first things first, we're talking about the security zone use case. Something is still, I don't know, I'm not saying this to discourage Nadia or something, but something doesn't really sound right to me about this use case is that is there actually people who with different tenants actually put different tenant workloads in the same namespace and then do that across a bunch of namespaces. So what you're saying is that for a admin, right? Maybe he created namespace ABC, And then 3 tenants come in and they just decided, oh, for my workloads, for tenant 1 workloads, I just wanted to put these workloads in the namespace, across namespace ABC. And then the second tenant and the third tenant decided to do the same thing. Then, it doesn't really make sense to me anymore on why the admin had to create this namespace in the first place, right? So what does this namespace actually signal, and how the cluster actually look like? The reason why I said that is that when we designed the admin hour policy at the very beginning, we were kind of like, everybody who jumped in the car, I know this is way before, right, 2 years maybe ago, everybody kind of agreed that a namespace or a bunch of namespaces combined do define tenancy in most of the use cases in what we are seeing the customers do as of now. So for whoever is asking for admin hour policy, this is the thing, and we also have different implementations or companies come in and say, hey, we also agree that the namespaces being tenancy is good, but we wanted to have a easier way to do selectors to select tenancies and define how tenancies can talk to each other. So this is sort of like the founding stone that we build the AMP on. And I'm just not feeling like really comfortable saying that, we're challenging that at the moment, because I personally haven't seen a lot of the use cases where we actually mix tenancies in namespaces like that. So, this is my first observation here. I don't know if Nadia, did you find the security zone use cases somewhere online, or you do know that you have worked with customers or whatnot who
Yes.
actually uses this sort of like construct? And is there a little bit more context you can provide on why a single tenant may want to put workloads in different namespaces and all the tenants will try to do the same?
Yeah, so I didn't get too many details about why the workloads look exactly like that specifically, but I know, as I said, this customer, they have a lot of namespaces and much less security zones. So
Okay.
these namespaces, in general, I don't think namespace has any networking meaning
Yes,
until
it does
we
not.
introduce this tenancy, right? So, and that's
Right,
also,
yeah.
I guess, what they follow, and they use namespace as some abstraction that was comfortable for them to adopt whatever they were running out of the cloud, like to just put that into our clusters, right? And they have, as I said, many namespaces that are like, they are logically separated workflows, and I specifically asked them how difficult it would be to change how these workloads look like, to make sure that the tenancy is like namespace based, and they said that would be very difficult for them. So I thought, like, and again, so what I'm not sure if we want to see if there are possible use cases like that, right? So I have one now, we can ignore it, we can say, yeah, we want to introduce that for customers. There is another thing I actually wanted to focus on a bit here, because in general, I guess namespace labels is something that is set by cluster admins, right? And then pod labels, every namespace owner can redefine.
Right.
So
yes.
that is like admin, if you create admin network policy based on pod label, then the namespace owner can just relabel the pod, and then network policy will not work, right? As we want from our admin level. So
yeah, but that's all the more reason to not use like this kind of mechanism, right? Like this customer is using. You want to do a tenancy on a namespace when that users cannot change.
So that makes sense. And then actually I guess that it should go along then with the subject selector also, because if we say that that's not safe to apply policies based on pod labels, then you shouldn't do that for the subject also. But then what I'm saying here is that I know of some customers that are using clusters like that, and they are like the owners of the cluster, and they are owners of every namespace, right? And then that fact that someone can change, the namespace owner can change labels, it doesn't mean anything for them because they are the admins and they apply labels, right? So,
Right.
I mean, I guess there are just like two decisions on this level. We can, to stay more or less consistent, we can either say that we just don't allow pod label based filtering for admin network policy because that's how we expect namespaces and pods in these namespaces to be labeled. Or we say that we kind of acknowledge there are some cases, as I said, when cluster admin owns all the namespaces and that may be like useful for them to have this kind of functionality. And then we just tell everyone, and I guess that also that's a good thing to say even with the existing API, to just have this warning about pod-based filtering, that namespace owners can just, I don't know, remove or relabel the pods, and then this network policy will not apply as you expect anymore.
I think there is a valid point. I've seen another customer run into the same issue, right? Like with pod labels changing, which is there for network policies as well today. The way I see it is we can have docs that say best practices, right, around using namespace selectors for tenancy, and that is what we have in mind as we define these use cases. But the pod selector is there just to give that freedom. But if they are using it in a way after which the users are going to change it, then that's on them, right? They can stop using the pod selector. Like if that's a problem, like it depends on your use cases and the kind of environments you've set up and what kind of permissions your users, the cluster have, right?
I think it's that like you're saying, sorry, it's like that subtle interaction, right? Like generically, I agree with you, Nadia, but then what if the admin owns that namespace, like the Cube system namespace, and they want even more fine-grained control about, you know, being allowed to say talk to kubedns only, for example. Like in that case, you need pod selectors. But when we start talking about defining tenants, I think that's totally different, right? Like tenancy, I think we want to err on the side of tenancy being hard, right? Like when an admin defines a tenant, I can't think of many times where they want that to be soft, right? They don't want to define soft tenancy boundaries. They want to define hard ones. So if there's some way for us to ensure that when we're defining tenants explicitly, you can only do so at the namespace level, that makes sense. But taking away the ability for an admin to specify pod specifically, I don't think makes sense at this time. But I totally see your point. And again, documentation is everything here, right? Like if we expect users to use this in a certain way and to set up tenants in a certain way, like we have to document that accordingly. And if there's some tiny subset of users, which I would say people setting up tenants that are sets of pods across namespaces are a smaller set of users, like as long as we define, you know, what we're doing with good documentation, we don't have to design to every little corner case. So it's a tricky one though.
Actually, yeah, for Jan, have you met any challenges with same and not same on your side, like either implementation wise or even like your users thinking it's a bit complex or anything like that?
To be honest with you, I think within Entrée, the same labels is still appear not merged, because I think a majority of users who are using Entrée right now are actually happy with the self and maybe not self implementation of this. In the sense of, you know, I know we talked about a lot of times, you know, tenancies are defined as a namespace boundary. Well, instead of a bunch of namespaces, the majority use cases we've seen Entrée users have, which obviously, you know, there are a lot of VMware integrated products, I would say, and a lot of these products use namespace as like a single namespace as a hard tenancy boundary. So that's why, you know, for Entrée use cases, usually when we have implemented self, right? So let's say I wanted to allow traffic coming from my own namespace, but nothing else, right? The other namespaces I just wanted to drop. So this has already satisfied, I think, the majority of the use cases that Entra users have. And I'm implementing the same labels just to sort of like be upstream compliant, right? So when
Yeah.
we do like admin hour policy, we wanted the ability to have a bunch of namespaces as a tenancy boundary, which is also from what I remember, maybe a year ago, a lot of the other guys comes in and say, this is what we envision the tenancy boundary be. We don't want it to only support a single namespace boundary, but a bunch of namespaces which with same labels as the tenancy boundary, which also makes sense to me. So this is where we add, and obviously we also implemented the same labels, which is in the PR. But as I said before, it is the not same labels that's a little bit trickier for us because of the no north-south selection, but only east-west thing. So essentially, we have it's a little bit more difficult for us to implement that in a very, very, scalable way, I would say. Because for us, it means that we needed to sort of like calculate the complement of the same label selection in the cluster. Because we are explicitly leaving out the north-south part, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Dan, for sharing that. And I think it's also valid, like in my head also for tenancy, I either had a single namespace or a bunch of them. But it is interesting to see that there are users who want to mix it up.
I think there's going to be an infinite number of user corner cases, to be honest. I don't want to go as far as saying this is a corner case, but like there's a lot of ways to set up Kubernetes clusters and define your users, define your groups, define how they're organized. The concept of a fully admin cluster, right? Where you're not necessarily, I want to say, like shipping a service to customers, but instead like using it as a platform for yourself to just run workloads on. I guess that's the one we're kind of, that Nadia is kind of running into and seeing. So we just have to think if we want to, moving forward, like change our definition of tenancy to expand to that or not. And I think the place to do that is probably in a dedicated issue for this, and we can like hash it out there and ultimately come to a conclusion based on more folks than just us.
So sorry about that. Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're good.
I think that the more the one thing that I take from Nadia's thought is that in a sense of what we do when users sort of like change the pod labels in an unexpected way, right? What if the user does just trying to escape the policy that admin has set for them? I don't know that. Do you have any idea, Nadia, on is there any potential solutions or something you see in terms of solving this, or do you think this is just a sort of like a loophole in terms of the policy definition here?
Do you mean solution to that specific use case?
Right.
Well, yeah, it actually can be like worked around because the number of security zones is predefined and more or less static. So you can just set regular admin network policies matching on pod labels to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of fine. It just was, so since we're still kind of defining the tenancy, right, and how it should work, and you just said that you didn't hear of a single use case where someone would use that across namespaces, I just thought I'll bring it up. So that's just like as an example of how something like tenancy can be spread across.
Oh yeah. I mean the thing that you talked about on, a user can actually change the pod label to escape admin hour policy thing.
yeah, you should not design network policies in a way that can be escaped like that, right? So that's what I was saying. We need to add documentation saying that if you kind of can only use pod selector for admin network policy if you control the namespaces this selector applies to, because otherwise pod labels are not under your control.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's a really good point, because to me, I do think this is sort of like out of the scope of the admin network policy API itself. But because if you think about this, if user do wanted to change pod labels, there's nothing really you can do about it. And other than the labels, I don't think of it like a good way for people to define, I wanted to select specific pods in the namespaces, which, no matter how the users change the pod labels, I will always be able to select that as a subject or whatnot, right? So this is not like a problem that's specific to ANP itself. I would say, like, for admin, I would imagine, right, if they wanted the whole package on, I wanted to enforce ANP on the pod granularity, then we needed to have something like, I have a admin label maybe on the pod saying that something like, Kubernetes.io, admin, or like labeled this pod as admin control, which is functionality, blah, blah, blah. And then we use this specific label to select the pod. And when user try to modify or delete the label, we have some other solutions in the cluster, maybe a webhook or whatnot, to prevent user from doing that, right? So this is sort of like an RBAC or other thing that are completely, I feel, orthogonal to the admin network policy API. Like the admin needs to make sure that if the admin is to want to make sure that, for the policy that have been set cannot be sort of like abused by users in certain ways, I do feel like there needs to be other mechanisms, RBAC wise, even for the namespace story, right? The admin needs to make sure that the users of the namespace, the tenants, cannot just come in and modify the namespace label so that they just simply escape the ANP, right? So this is something I personally feel like is orthogonal to the API design of the ANP, which is we just provided, the way to sort of like help admin to set, these guardrail rules so that we can define the tenancy boundary. But, we actually needed some, maybe some other things to make sure that it is not sort of like bypassed intentionally because user just wanted to, sabotage the, I won't say sabotage, but they wanted to sort of like bypass, all the rules that have been set up by the means. That's what I'm thinking on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, that definitely makes sense. I guess still, since we're like defining the cluster-wide objects, it's still nice to share this kind of knowledge and possible drawbacks, right? And I also think there are some use cases where actually admins may use that pod-based labeling, just saying to their clients that they can label their pod with this label and something will be allowed to them, for example, right? So it can be used both in a good and bad way. So if we just can clarify that a bit, I guess that would make sense.
Okay. Cool. So out of that, I think what we should do is open a issue for kind of looking at tenancy in general for like the next iteration. I don't think we should redo it in V1 Alpha 1. So that's probably a good takeaway here.
I guess Surya said that Dan is kind of preparing something around that already. Maybe he would own that or not.
Oh, I don't think it's more about who owns it or not. I think I think I agree with Andrew on the fact that we can release the API as is, given Yang's done his part, and I can try to do same labels and not same labels in OV and K if needed. And then we can reiterate on the tenancy on V2 on how we want to change it. But yeah, Nadia, I'm not sure if like we just finished KubeCon and we're just back. So I think he said he will not be here this Tuesday, but maybe the one in 2 weeks, he might be able to get something.
So sure. Do you think Dan's idea on, maybe we wanted to change the tenancy thing, it's still based on the namespace labels, right? So do you think
Yeah.
it's drastically different than the API we have right here, or it's just sort of like semantic change? Like, sorry, not semantic, just like API type of change, but semantically, the implementation would basically be the same.
I think implementation might not vary too much, but at the same
Okay.
time, the part that it will really vary for me is right now, if you use the same and not same, you can
Mhm.
have different combinations of matches, right? So let's say you have label 1A and label 2B, right? On
Mhm.
your subject. And
Mhm.
then you can have peers that are selected using a relation of label A, right? But the
Mhm.
subject itself was selected using label B, right? And that was one of
Right.
the confusions that Nadia had raised in her
I
presentation.
see.
With a
see
lot
what you
of
mean.
different, yeah. So the same rule, the same policy can generate multiple dynamic rules. So the peer to subject relation is not really, as it is for selectors, right? Because of this. So that is the real part that Dan is trying to fix, because he thinks it can be confusing, and that is not something that we intended to do as tenancy. It's like we said, right? We wanted a full namespace as a tenant, and it's mostly is the same tenant or is it not the same tenant? And this can either be a single namespace or a bunch of namespaces.
So
That was our use case,
yeah,
I guess.
yeah, makes
right?
sense. So
But-
he's trying to cut down the freedom to define
Correct.
whatever labels that can go into the same label. In the
Yes.
sense of whatever label you use to select the subject, you should be using the same labels to select same label
Tenants
here.
Yes.
to make tenants.
Yeah,
So
that makes
what
sense.
he would, what he was proposing is just like we have subject today, we'd have another field called tenancy, and tenancy will have a list of labels. But then we won't have any more same labels and not same labels in the peers. What we'll have is what Antrea has today, which is like is same or is not same, right? And that relation will map to the tenancy. So all it means is the labels that you use to define the tenancy as is.
Can I ask, do you have some users for the network plugins that are implementing this API now for this tenancy? Or do you only do that because it's in the API?
Well, it's not really like in the API because we kind of like designed the API. But I know for Antrea at least, we, as I said, we do have customers who use namespace as tenancy boundaries, and we kind of like did want to go with this when we designed the API in the first place, is because I think a really long time ago, maybe more than a year ago, we have these initial people who is interested in developing a main network policy, and I think those are from different companies, and they were talking about the use cases and some sort of like quote unquote ad hoc network policies that they come up with to solve the use case. And we look at these policies and say, oh, they write these because they wanted to group these namespaces together, and they wanted to group those namespaces together. And then the takeaway from all these talks was that for all the customers or implementations we have talked about in terms of tenancy, the namespace boundary seems to be the mainstream of how a tenancy is defined in a cluster these days. So I think this is I guess the history of it.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you.
So I think for me, like that sounds great. We'll make an issue. We can think about refactoring that for the next version. For this version, literally for V1 Alpha 1, like I would like to just cut it, right? So go ahead and do a release of it. And this is the only PR I think we need to like figure out or resolve before I can do that. I don't know if y'all agree. The one just to fix the description of same, not same labels. We already removed namespace relation, I believe, right? Surya, so.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
we did. I think I'm okay with that. I can go and update the description alone, and for now, we can cut it, and then I think, like Shane said, for gateway, for conformance testing, we don't have to mandate the implementation of these two fields for the CNI plugins to make them conformant. We can keep them as optional, but keep the rest of the API fields as mandatory.
I like that. So then we have our cut release of V1 Alpha 1. You two are both using it in your implementations. And we can like officially, quote unquote, move all this conversation into working towards a V1 Beta 1 or V1 Alpha 2, right? I think that'll just make everything a lot easier.
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay, Nadia, this is another separate one I think you want to talk about.
I
Or no,
see we
sorry.
don't. Yeah, see we don't
Asymmetry.
have too much time left. We can maybe postpone that if there are other
Yeah.
topics for today.
That's fine. I don't think there was really too much else. Surya just poking for a view on the.
Oh, okay. Well, then we can, I don't know, quickly look at that.
Yep. So just
Yeah,
folks here, like we're trying to figure out our user stories for egress cluster control. Surya's open to PR. I've been reading it. I haven't had any comments yet. But we definitely need like complete consensus on this before we merge it, I think.
Yeah. Yang, if you have some time to review this one, I would really appreciate it. I think Dan gave it one pass, but once we have the use cases nailed down, I was thinking of doing a proper network policy enhancement proposal. I don't know, I was joking with Shane about this. We should have our own NPEPs like the gaps and gateway.
Yeah,
to
sure.
Yeah, to see how the exact API semantics would look like and have that charted out. But this is something that we at Red Hat would like to have as soon as possible. And we want it to be an upstream first thing, right? But if we sense some delay, it's something that we might have to do downstream, which I don't really want.
Yeah, I know. My bad. I'll take a look at today.
Thank you. Yeah.
Cool.
Can
And then
sorry,
I'll
can
toss it back over to Nadia.
I actually have a question about that egress use cases. We don't do anything for ingress because we didn't have any use cases for that, right?
Yeah,
Correct.
that's correct.
For
And
like
it's a lot harder to define. I think that's the other kind of an issue there, right? Because when most clusters are using some sort of ingress mechanism, i.e. the ingress API or the gateway API, that's another interaction that we need to start exploring. But it's not like as simple as defining egress.
yeah, but about nodes ingressing to pods, that is not covered now, but it's inside the cluster, right? Don't we want to include that?
Do we have valid use cases from users or customers? Because I know egress is an important ask for multiple customers. Has anyone on our side actually asked for this, Nadia? If yes, we should definitely think about it.
Well, I know some examples of people using that in regular network policy, and I think some of these cases would make sense on a cluster level. I don't know.
So on regular network policies, do they use IPs of pods to do node to pod, or they just use selectors? Like you use selectors as a subject to the host network pod gets chosen, and then
Yeah, I think something like deny all is quite popular in general for ingress also. And that includes just 0/0 CIDR.
Oh, may I step in very quickly on this topic? So I actually see a very strong use case. For instance, if we can imagine some kind of small cluster in front of some, let's say, scientific instrument, which is basically a bunch of hardware outside that cluster, and then we want some kind of controlling applications inside that cluster, and those applications will definitely need to access hardware. So I think that's something like a strong use case for, but maybe I'm mistaken, sorry.
No,
No,
no.
I think that's a great use case. Like I actually had sorry, Andrew, I cut over you. I'll just make
No,
it
no,
quick.
no. You're good. Go.
Yeah, it was a good use case, Igor. The question I had is like, your hardware is outside the cluster, and you said your apps are inside the cluster, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, so imagine it's like two boxes. So one box has a cluster with a lot of applications running. I mean, in this particular case, and the cluster, I mean Kubernetes cluster, right? So
Mhm.
we deploy a bunch of applications there, like which may, let's say, build some dashboards or whatever, some alerting stuff, or even some controlling things where users want to interact with the hardware on the other side. And then there is a bunch of hardware which is effectively outside that cluster, and it might have some kind of network endpoints, and we definitely want to talk to those from within the cluster.
Yeah,
Does that
that's
makes
it
things clear?
makes it makes sense totally. Like the only thing that doesn't really work for me with the southbound use case always is that pods have private IPs. So anything coming ingress from outside the cluster is already kind of protected. So I'm thinking, what do we want to really deny? Is it anything coming from the internet to the pod that we want to hit here, or like that's the one thing that ingress bothers me about. But yeah, I think it could be a
Well,
valuable
I
one.
could imagine, for instance, if you have a single cluster for multiple, let's say, research groups within the research facility, and then the hardware on another side. So, for instance, if we think about some kind of synchrotron facilities, they usually have a storage ring where electrons spinning, and then they have beam lines where actual science happens, so to say. And it's usually, well, maybe not usually, but at least in facilities I used to work, it's kind of one network. So technically one scientist from one group can access directly hardware from which is completely unrelated. And so it would be nice to say, okay, I have an application, let's say it's a kind of dashboard, and that particular application may access only this range of whatever IPs or this, so limit somehow that hardware access. And this, you may think about the hardware access as basically as a network endpoint spinning elsewhere.
Yeah, to me that sounded more egress. You said your apps are dashboards that are trying to talk to the hardware, which is a
Yeah.
bunch of IPs. So that's egress, right?
Yeah, but we are discussing egress right now, huh?
No, in ingress. Nadia was saying why we don't have the opposite scenario, like from outside to inside. So let the hardware trying to talk to the apps scenario being blocked, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's also a valid scenario, because you obviously want data from the hardware coming in those applications and then show them to the users. But I'm sorry that. Yeah,
If that is a
Shares-
reply,
sorry.
if the data you're describing coming back is a reply to a request coming from the pod that is inside the cluster, then
Not-
it's still egress.
It's not necessarily. It
No?
can be
Okay.
that the hardware is kind of pushing data.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that sounds like a use case we might want to consider. Igor, do you want to leave a comment on the issue here, the 86 that Andrew has highlighted? And we
Yeah, I
talk
can do
more?
that, sure.
Yeah, and thanks Nadia and Igor for bringing this up. What I can do is either we keep the egress and ingress separate, but if ingress within the cluster seems easier, right? Like what I'm concerned is ingress from outside the cluster, which is tricky to implement. So I might even suggest Igor to open an issue with the use case, right? A new issue on our repo, and let's take it there, because then we can keep egress separate from ingress.
Yeah, I think we definitely should keep ingress separate from egress. Because that was I think that was one of the mistakes with network policies. They just lumped it all together. So Cool. Okay, we have a couple minutes left. Nadia, do you want to get started on this next one, or do you want to save it for next time?
I don't know. I'm not sure how long it will take. That's not a big topic.
Okay, yeah, go ahead then.
Yeah, I should just be on that slide. I had this question about asymmetry about our subject definition, right? I've asked before, I guess, so that we can define subject as namespaces with namespace only label selector, and then as pods that has both. And then basically when you define namespaces, you implicitly define empty pod selector, right? Well, at least that's what it means. So what I just made a little comparison here of how you currently can define something versus like if you just had a symmetric version of that without like namespaces or pods fields, right? So
So
yeah.
I think the one thing that was like previous history here, and I'm trying to reboot my mind, but like right now, a subject is basically a one of, right? It's either pods or namespaces. You have to
Yes.
define either a namespaced peer or a namespace pod peer, whatever. That design schema was done explicitly for extensibility in the future. So meaning like
you could have services, for example, if service mesh comes into play, that can be, that we are also trying to consider some of the expansions. And actually, this is also something that Dan and I talked about. And we were like, okay, in addition to namespace and pods, if there is something in future that comes up, then we want it to be separate entities. But
I'm
having
trying to
said that,
remember though, how does this doing it just like this break things? That's what I'm
No, yeah, but
there's a
having
thing
said
called,
that,
sorry.
sorry, no, I was about to say, having said that, I reached the same conclusion, right? Like for me, it's not really about symmetry or asymmetry. For me, it's the same thing. It's just the way we do it. You can either do the name, at the end of the day, you're having a namespace selector and a pod selector, the current way and the other way. So it, for me, doesn't really matter how we define it.
I think I can speak a little bit about that. I think it's the whole file open, file closed story that we had like wasted, I would say, hundreds of minutes on, discussing. But the short version is, if we do it like this on the right side, let's say like in the future we introduce a service selector in the parallel of the namespace selector and the pod selector, right? And the issue we found out is that if we introduce that and a old implementation, let's say it's of a Kubernetes or Rancher or whatever implementations that does implement the API, which doesn't know about the service selector yet. So that implementation will not look at the service selector. So let's say people put a namespace selector with a service selector with the intention of, I want to select specific services in that namespace, right? And what the implementation sees is that it only sees the namespace selector because it doesn't really actually know about the service selector. So the implementation looks at the policy and parse it as, I want to select everything in the namespace, because it doesn't even know about the service selector. So that is not the intention of the policy writer, because he or she doesn't really want to select everything in the namespace. They just wanted to select specific service in the namespace. So then we have a discrepancy between the intention and what the implementation actually does. So in order to avoid those kinds of problems, we have to be really, really explicit, like what we do on the left-hand side, where, we wanted to make sure that people either select a namespace or a pod, or once the service comes in, right, in the future, they need to say that I wanted to select the subject, and the subject type is service. And you provide different selectors on how you actually select these services. So in short, this is by design. It is really explicit, really redundant, but it is the way it is because we want it to be future proof. So
Yeah,
I
that
don't know.
makes perfect sense, and that explains why you would need one more level. So like pods, right? Under that. That doesn't explain why you can still select the same thing. I've just updated that to reflect what you said, right? You could just do this. So because first of all, I can imagine people coming to me and asking what this namespaces thing selects if pod selector is something different, but namespace selector still selects pods. And we do have still two ways to express the same thing in the API, which is usually not a good thing for the API, right? So you still can have this extensibility with one more level here, but have only one way of expressing things.
I feel you. I feel you. I think what we think is that for example, in the documentation itself, on the left-hand side, you have the pod namespace selector equals label selector and the pod selector being an empty one. This should never occur in the documentation because even though it does the same thing as the above, essentially, whoever write this is just trying to select namespace. So even though we provide the flexibility to do that, we should never see the policy written like this because by the end of the day, you're trying to select namespaces, right? So we're sort of like given the flexibility, and when people do actually want to select pods, we expect the pod selector to not be empty. We don't sort of like require that, and reject the policy if it's written like this. But you need to really, know that by the end of the day, you're selecting namespaces, and you should not write pods as a subject. Does that make sense?
I am not sure if you're saying that empty selectors should not be there because they still will be there in some other cases, right?
No.
They'll be there because they're built into types. I think like this goes back a long way. And another big part of this was like building a YAML that was really explicit and easy. So like if a user wants to select namespaces and there's a tool, i.e. a YAML field called namespaces, why the heck would a user ever use the tool called pods?
Yeah, that's my point. Yes.
I think that's what, yeah. And Yang and I hashed our teeth over this for a long time. That's kind of, but I fully understand what you're saying, Nadia. I'm thinking if we really want to get down into it here, we're over time too. So I'm going to try to wrap this up. If we really wanted to drill our teeth down into it here, we could do some validation, especially with Kubernetes X validation, to say pod selector must be set, but cannot be empty. Right? That would fix your problem. Then you could not explicitly select a namespace easily by doing what you did on the right.
But then you cannot select, the way to select all pods in the cluster would be through namespace, but I want to select pods, not all namespaces.
Well, by selecting the namespace, you're actually selecting pods in the end, right? We just group these pods in the namespace, and then you need to understand that you're actually selecting the namespace, every pod in the namespace. That's what I'm saying.
I mean, every time I see namespace selector in this case, I'm thinking about pods because I know I'm selecting pods, right? That's why maybe it's like my perception, right, of that. So if you thought about that a lot already, I'm like, I've had some answers, right? If you think that's not worth keep discussing, I think that's fine. I mean, it looks like I definitely miss some history, right, as you're saying here. So
yeah, I see.
Sorry, go ahead, Yang.
No. I'll just say that I'm happy to sort of like discuss a little bit, offline with you if you have any more concerns or something. But so to me, I need to be really honest here because Andrew and I have been in the in the game for over a year, and to me, I feel like the more important thing right now is sort of like we presented the API in a way that makes sense to the users, and it can achieve the use cases that majority users want to see at this level, but not to be too sort of like fixated on what the API look like exactly, because sometimes some APIs can be really confusing. But looking at this as a, selecting namespace or pods as a subject, I don't feel like this is really confusing, and it achieves the sort of like use cases that we have, came up this far. So my intention is that unless it's sort of like really confusing to the users, maybe we should not, look at and changing it. That's what I'm, thinking on this matter.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'm gonna +1 on Yang here.
Yeah, me too, +1, especially because I've implemented it. I do not want to change it, sorry.
But it's a really good point. So it's something we should think about. And I also think it's something we should document, right? Like this should be some sort of note in our documentation about this ambiguity.
Yeah. And I think we should also document what Yang was saying, right? Like while we do provide a way to have that, the part on the left side with pods, with empty namespace and pod, we should not let users do that as an example, and they should just use namespaces.
Cool.
Well, that's my point. They technically can, right? So if you just wanted to drive somewhere that's only 1 mile away, they can take a highway and take a detour, tens of U-turns, and they get there, right? They're free to do that. It's just that in the documentation, what we should do is that we should provide the example saying that you should use the namespace selector and be done with it. And if they really wanted to go that route, fine, we provide
Good
Mm.
luck.
flexibility, but that's not what we envisioned people would do, right?
I mean, and
my
think of us
point.
as programmers, the number one thing we do is Google Kubernetes network policy, pull the default network policy they put there, and then edit it to
Right,
our
exactly,
use
yeah.
case. Okay, that was a good conversation though. It is really interesting. And API design like this, you run into it all the time. So I'd like to have a note on it. But we are way over time. I'm super sorry for keeping you all late. We've had a ton of good conversation. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it here. Let's continue over to Slack if we want to. Happy to keep talking. And yeah, I'm gonna work on getting a release cut before next meeting for V1 Alpha 1, and then we'll set our eyes squarely on implementations there and onto the next iteration. So onto the egress stories and any other user stories we want to target for beta. But thanks so much everyone for all your time today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all the help. And we'll talk to you all soon. Have a good one.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.